What is a calling? What is a calling? How would you answer that question? What is a calling? Perhaps you're living your calling now. Your calling may be your work. You're not in it for the money. Never were. Perhaps you're living your calling now. Your calling is raising a family. It's difficult work. I haven't done it myself, but I know how hard I made it for my parents. Perhaps you're living your calling now. Maybe this calling is just for a season. Life circumstances made it abundantly clear that you needed to do something or be somewhere you never thought you'd be, doing what you never thought you'd do. Perhaps you're living your calling now. You're doing what you feel you were made to do. That's a great feeling, isn't it? You've discovered profound meaning in your identity as a teacher, for instance, whatever it may be. How did you know? How did you know when that calling came? Did God somehow lead you there? What is a calling? How would you answer that question? The scriptures, of course, have many answers for us, where more than a few people were called by God. And while no two callings in the Bible are identical, they tend to have a lot of similarities. Think of Sarah, right? Formerly known as Sarai, called to have a child of God's covenant, to make of Sarah and her husband Abraham a great nation. Do you remember her response to God's call? She laughed. Are you kidding? She was 99 years old. Think back to Moses, called to Egypt to deliver God's special people from slavery. He was reluctant. It's the last thing he wants to do. Same thing with Gideon. Do you remember from the book of Judges? He's called to lead God's people. And that's the last thing he wants to do. All throughout the history of the people of God, people are called to do some pretty remarkable things, some big jobs, important stuff we'd usually rather not do either. Now, it's no different for Isaiah, probably the best known prophet in the Old Testament today. He's one of three major prophets in the Old Testament. Yes, because he has an important job to do, but mainly because he wrote a lot. Right? So much that his writings filled an entire scroll by themselves. It's the same for Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the other two major prophets in our Old Testament. All of the other 12 prophets with named books in our Old Testament, those are called minor prophets. Not because their jobs were unimportant, but simply because their books are a lot shorter. There's a lot less to their writings. In fact, all 12 of those minor prophets fit very nicely on one scroll. So you get the sense for the scope of Isaiah's prophecy. And Isaiah has one of the most wonderful encounters with the Lord. And I just love how it's reported in such vivid detail. He finds himself in the presence of God. He witnesses these seraphim, these angelic beings whose only job it is to worship God. Maybe we haven't found ourselves in the throne room of heaven, but maybe we've had moments where we have sensed the Spirit of God powerfully. And in those moments, if you've experienced them, it can humble you rather quickly. You might immediately find a sense of gratitude, find yourself thanking God simply for the moment, as you come face to face with something so much bigger than us. Isaiah's response is confession. Woe to me! I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Isaiah's confession, like all our confessions to God, is met with grace. And it's in that space, in that offering of forgiveness, that God's call comes to Isaiah. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Asked the Lord. Isaiah responds with a refrain that's found throughout the scriptures on the lips of the often reluctant faithful. Here am I, send me. So what will his calling be? If you heard Gina, she gave us a hint already. Isaiah is to go to Jerusalem, to the capital of the small southern kingdom, and he's to tell that kingdom, guys, our days are numbered. What happened to the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes up north, is going to happen to us sooner or later as well. Oh, well, it's official. Isaiah's unhinged again. Can you imagine the people's response to hearing such things? Now, I'm not typically in the habit of listening to people shouting in the street that the end is near either. The lower story perspective that we've been discerning and trying to figure out together is often a narrow one, something we know well. And sometimes it doesn't allow us to realize what's really going on right in front of us. For the people of Israel, it's no different. They're worshiping idols, living their lives as they please, making God kind of an afterthought to life. God kind of stays on the periphery, never invited into the center of one's devotion. It is no wonder the upper story message of God, directly from Isaiah and other prophets, is so easily lost. Put God first. Strive with your heart, soul, mind, and strength to do the will of God, to love your neighbors as you love yourself, to stay close to God's heart, and to commune with God daily. You know, Hezekiah was one of those kings that got it right. Out of the 39 or so sent, he was, I think, one of 5 that got it right, that stayed faithful. And unfortunately, most of the other kings lead the people astray. So at this point in God's upper story, another drastic action is needed. So Amos and Hosea, those prophets we talked about last week, they are Isaiah's kind of northern prophetic counterparts. They've been sounding the warnings for years that Isaiah is now called to give to the southern kingdom, even begging, cajoling the people to remember the upper story. But as we learned this week, it all goes unheeded. The 10 tribes in the northern kingdom are conquered by Assyria, the most powerful nation at that time, in 722 BCE. Their strategy is really quite brilliant too. Assyria, with its incredible military might, goes into a country, makes them a vassal state to the empire. Then they send the elite of the people they're conquering, the priests, the kings, the royal court, the artisans even, the upper classes, into exile. But they don't just leave it at that. Then they repopulate Israel with foreigners, with folks from their own country, Assyrians. And the idea here is that by removing all of those Israelite leaders, the elite from the land, and sticking them in places around the empire, they will not be able to regroup and get back home. But even if they would be able to do that, other people would be there in their place. It's a brilliant strategy, and Assyria does it over and over again in the ancient Near East. You know, you've heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, or the lost tribes of Israel. This is how it happens. Now only 2 tribes of God's special covenant nation remain in that southern kingdom of Judah. Now this piece of Israel's history is especially important to remember when we get to the New Testament. Why is that? Well, over time, you guessed it, the Israelites start to intermarry with those Assyrians now settled in their land. What's the problem there, you ask? Well, Israel starts to lose its unique identity as God's chosen nation. They start to lose their religion a little bit, and a new group of people begins to form in Israel's place. You know the name of that group of people? They're the Samaritans. Samaritans. Over centuries, ironically, the southern kingdom of Judah will become enemies with the Samaritans, mortal enemies. Hence the shock when Jesus will tell his parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? What's the punchline there? I'm sure you know it. What do you mean a Samaritan saved a Jew in the ditch? Went above and beyond, put his own life at risk to save a Jew, his mortal enemy. The birth of the Samaritans begins over 700 years before Jesus is born. So all of this is happening in the north. Isaiah is called to go to the south, to the southern kingdom, and tell them that unfortunately the same will soon happen to them. Now do we understand just how heavy Isaiah's call is? Why he may have been invited into that throne room of heaven to inspire him, to give him the courage and the strength to go do what he had to do. Now, like I said, Hezekiah really did well for the south. They had a wonderful reign together. But his son, Manasseh, undoes everything his father worked so hard to establish. Judah will hold out until the year 586 BC. But then it will all come crashing down. Assyria captures the north, Babylon will capture the south. And that's where we're going to pick up next week in this story. Isaiah carries this heavy burden, but he also speaks some of the most important words for us Christians today. Now, for 39 chapters, Isaiah will warn Judah to shape up, often with some really harsh words. Then, all of a sudden, in Isaiah chapter 40, the tone changes completely. Read that chapter this week. Some of the best known, most beautiful words in the Bible. A student of Isaiah most likely wrote these words in the next 15 chapters, far after Isaiah had died, some 60 years after the nation will spend in exile. And these words announce to Judah that it is time to come home, back to the promised land. Among these words are the hopeful words about a servant who suffers terribly, but then is redeemed by God and becomes a light to the nations. Now, Judah first understood these words to be about them. 700 years or so later, others will come to believe that these words were really about a future Messiah that came in the person of Jesus Christ. Amazing, isn't it? The message was written there all along. The fail-safe piece of the story, written in plain view, God was working out even then. But yet it was so hard to see. And of course, it wouldn't have been written at all had Isaiah not said yes to God's call. So I wonder then, what God can do with our yeses. Have you ever thought about that? What can God do with our saying yes? How would you answer that question? Is your calling to speak some difficult words, as unpopular as they might be? Speak them, yes, but speak them with the love of God. Is your calling to use a gift God has given you that you're not currently using because it would make life more difficult, more inconvenient, make you unpopular? Let God lead you into unfamiliar territory. Trust in God to guide each scary step. Is your calling to begin listening to God, to hear what that calling in your life might be? Well, maybe you'll commit this year to spending as much time in silence and in prayer listening to God as you spend on Facebook, or as you spend watching cable news. That's one of my resolutions, by the way. Is your calling to care for someone or some group of people, or even yourself, in a way that you've needed to do for a long time, but simply have not had the courage to try? Well, may you know that wherever or whoever it is, God is already there waiting for you to point and say, God is here. You are not alone. Is your calling to make a major change in your life for your health or the health of your family or community? Have you not known? Have you not heard? Isaiah asked the nation of Judah. The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow weary. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Is your calling to radically realign priorities in your life, as hard as and exhausting as change might be, so that more of your time might be given to those in need, here at church or in Washington? He gives power to the faint, Isaiah said, and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. How is God calling us this year? How is God calling to you? What would you say to that question? Well, I say no matter how we answer that question, there is nothing quite like being in line with the will of God. I wish I was in line more often, but the struggle is worth it. It's rarely an easy path. It's far easier to run the other way. But just imagine all that could be if you say, "Here am I, send me."